Yes.
Nobody comes to the last day of term.
Is it the last day of term? I don't ever know.
I don't really know.
He's Taras.
So we should. No, Tadas told us that was he left. He went to home. I didn't want to say if he went to. I didn't remember what home was, so I didn't want to assume or make to say something wrong. So I just,
Oh yeah, he has.
Oh, that has got
yes, he's visiting his family.
Yes.
And the rest I don't know. There were a lot of students earlier.
I think quite a lot of them are just sitting in there, they're not actually taking the course.
That's okay, that makes sense, yes. Well,
It should have been like this all along.
good. Then we can start. Today we had, the title was Observer, the observer position, possibility of observer, something like that. The problem of an objective position for the observer and how what these requires, entails and requires, and at the same time the whole problem of lack of ground or a ground that is groundless and yet functions, the notion of rhizomes, surfaces, have undermined this position of the objective observer. And I think that the best way to look at this problem for today's readings, or through today's readings, is through the concept of territorialization and deterritorialization that we have seen in the letters, but also came back with Barad and keeps coming up since Heidegger. How things are organized, take on a distribution, a meaning, an economy, a way of working without representing something, but being organized out of a way of being, which we've been calling a surface, that juxtapose everything and anything without order. You remember the description we read all together of the skin of the Barad, all these parts of the body just floating about, and they progressively take on order. Now, what the last concept we haven't worked through entirely is the concept of entanglement, which has different ways of being interpreted, but I believe that the way it is represented understood and presented by both Barad and Isabel Stengers is very interesting, because it's not simply an adaptation of the problem that physics finds to ontology. And then next to that, we have to read discourse figures, Veduta on a fragment of the history of desire. Did you try any of the texts for today?
Not that one.
You started on Veduta.
Leotard's the highest from the stone.
It is a dense text. Did anybody try the bits on Stengers on measuring and the event of Lagrangian event?
Wasn't it The Artifice or something like that? Wasn't it?
There were two big books.
Right.
One was Life and the Artifice, and the other one was you read that very good.
But
But the other one
not
was
particularly helpful.
The Invention of Mechanics, the Power of Reason. The two books of Stengers, Invention of Mechanics and the Power of Reason, and Life and the Artifice, are supposed to work. The first one, Invention of Mechanics and the Power of Reason, in parallel with the description that Barad gives of modern space in painting, and how that describes a way of looking at the world as a representation. and life and the artifice is an elaboration of the problems raised by the notion of emergence from complexity, and works in dialogue with the notion of entanglement as Barad discusses it. Those of you that were in Nottingham a month ago or so, listening to Stengers, she mentioned Barad a number of times in the talk she gave. So this is why there was so much to read in these two different directions. Probably before we go into details, Dana has prepared some sort of presentation about what entanglement means, because probably it's much more knowledgeable than I am on this topic. And then we can, keeping what this in mind, we can sort of delve into the problems that these might raise, and how, what kind of problems and how to deal to use them or deal with them.
Yep, so, well, entanglement is one of the trickiest sort of phenomena in quantum physics to really sort of get to grips with in sort of real world terms, and it's still a very emerging field, so it's always changing, but I'll give you sort of an overview of what the foundations are in entanglements. So basically, first consider a particle. A particle has what they would call a quantum state. It has position, it has momentum, it has quantum spin and so on, but this is before it's all measured. If you measure it, you sacrifice some of the information somewhere, with the uncertainty principle, momentum being inversely proportional to momentum. You can measure the position of something, or you can measure how fast it's going. You can't have certainty on one and the other. You have to choose sort of what you're measuring, and where you put your measuring stick determines what sort of information you're going to get from a particle in its quantum state. And when particle, that's just one particle, but when you've got two or more particles together, they can sort of come together to become an entangled system. So essentially, these particles come together, they act in the same way, they do the same things, they sort of mirror each other, but not as a mirror, because they're working as a whole. This quantum system is sort of it's a whole, so you can't distinguish between sort of the parts that are in there. The system is the whole thing. The bits just are sort of don't really matter in this whole thing. The system is what you sort of want to look at, and what essentially the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's the essential rule of this quantum entangled system. But like, it's not similar to the whole metaphysics, whole sum of parts. It takes bits from that, but it provides gives it a foundation in sciences, in quantum physics. And in this system, these particles move, they relate to each other. If one moves, one pushes, one pulls, it doesn't matter. In this system, doesn't rely on distance in a traditional sense. These particles can be at different ends of the universe, but they can still sort of react to each other. And it's not then they're not communicating with each other either. There's no. They don't send messages back and forth between each other. They don't know what each other's doing in that sense, but they are entangled in this relation that keeps them together, lets them know what the other's doing in a sense, without this sending back and forth. It's a very sort of strange kind of relation. And Einstein didn't like this. He didn't like quantum physics as a whole. He didn't like the idea of uncertainty being in science. So he called this idea of entanglement spooky action at a distance. Why? He just didn't see how particles which couldn't talk to each other could still know what the other was doing. So for Einstein, that would mean that they would have to communicate faster than the speed of light, which, as Einstein says, that there is nothing that can go faster than the speed of light. That's how he comes up with his paradox with this spooky action. And I suppose with more of the modern developments in quantum physics and entanglement is where time and space actually start to emerge. It's where relations in temporal spatial mechanics start to happen before these particles are measured, before they're in the system together. There's no real sort of time and space. There's no idea of relation before. There's no absolute background within which to measure time or space, because they don't exist before this entangled state. And also in this, the system is very sort of, we're talking subatomic particles here. It's a very fragile system, so it can be very easily disrupted. If someone or something takes a measurement of it, it can very easily be broken. If you put a cut somewhere, that particles can start to go in completely different directions. So there are ways to measure, or check whether a system is entangled, whether particles are entangled in some sense, but it requires not measuring in a sense. It requires a completely different way to do science, to do practices, to account for completely different materials, really. And as we said, Karen Barad looks at how to deal with those practices in feminist, anti-cultural, anti-racist techno-sciences, similar to Donna Haraway. They're both very sort of entangled with each other. They both try to find what the implications for this are. Not as just a reinterpreting of reality, but as we said with the quantum thing, there's no time or space before they emerge in this state. So they're looking to figure out really how these, they don't like to call them activist sort of projects, but these interruptions of feminism and anti-racist projects, how do they emerge in traditional theories? How do they interrupt? How do they sort of exist in a sense? And I think that's sort of where Stengers is also taking her work in. And she's worked with scientists with completely across different disciplines, and she doesn't. Well, she's always trying to keep that separation from an institution which would interrupt these active projects and take them, or give them definitions which necessarily don't belong to them.
Good, thank you very much.
So, so the quantum world isn't necessarily entanglement?
No, not necessarily.
Right.
However, entanglement becomes an interesting concept when you have, mostly in theoretical physics, but not only, because biology has the same problem with the DNA. You have objects, scientific objects, things that are discovered and created mathematically, and then after a long process of experimentation created in the laboratory, like the neutrino. And once they are created, proved by the experiment that is carefully crafted, they exist as if they had been always there, and they become part of the overall picture of the universe. And the universe, the model of the universe that scientists have, cannot do without that particle that was being somehow backward into it. Now, this is a way of
That's what it is.
it's is in a certain way the problem of entanglement as if it is for us, because we have thought of it, we mathematically described it and placed it, then built an experiment apt to find it where we thought it had to be, and somehow built it. And found it because it's the ultimate subjective point of view, right? Because we put it there. But these things that we found by putting it there has all the characteristics, all this exists as having always been there from the beginning of time, so much longer than our ability of observation. Now, this is what some part of science rejects as an absurdity. This is what the new speculative realism move that has emerged in the last 7-10 years rejects, saying no, that was there absolutely, and there is no argument about it. And we have the Cartesian tool of mathematics for reaching it. And instead, both Stengers and Barad come from a different angle to this problem and don't want to explain the problem away. They don't want to reach one conclusion or the other. There are three expressions Stengers keeps using throughout these two books, which are slowing down, staying with the problem, and resisting. Resisting the application of a model. Instead of her position, instead of being simply one of siding for the impossibility of objective knowledge, of thinking that the object is there and obviously through my senses and through mathematics I can get to know it. The opposite version would be, the immediate opposite version would be Karl Popper, that says a scientific theory is not true. It is valid until it is disproved by new experiments, so one has to re-elaborate the theory and fine-tune it. So there is this turning inside out, first turning inside out of the dream or the ideology of linearity to get to know the it there through science. And instead she says, it's not even this, much more radical. She's not refusing the model, because her position is that the model is a platform for asking questions and refusing objections. She has repeated that probably 4 or 5 times during the talk, and really stood out for me. So she's saying we need the model, we can't reject the notion of models. But what is very important is to slow down that model. To slow down so that we can hear all of the possibilities without foreclosing any of those possibilities. This is what she discusses in The Art of Models in Life of the Artists. But also, what becomes very interesting in this slowing down is that here is where she meets Karl Barad, because the notion of we'll read some so it becomes more clear. She adopts yet another scientific concept, which is diffraction. Diffraction, sorry, yes. And she's very clear about this. Diffraction, as would be at first, is a metaphor. I'm not saying that ontology is diffraction, but is a very useful tool to go through the expectations of objective knowledge, to go through the expectation of a knowledge that is already structured from a rational, linear, and Euro-centered or Western-centered male point of view, and look at things in a different way. Now, the different way is not a different angle. It's just dwelling on the same spot, slowing it down, and seeing all the possible consequences. Diffraction is a phenomenon that happens in classic physics with light. If light goes through a small slit, the shadow is not a sharp margin, but multiplies itself into lines of lightness and shadows. And it happens also for waves, waves of water and so forth. It multiplies. So you do not have one answer. You have a range of possibilities. So So that's why in the way it is taken as an example of what is happening. If you slow it down, stay with the problem, resist the problem being applied blindly, but also resist rejecting the problem, you find yourself in a very interesting position where you can really listen to science, really listen to engaging with the work. It's not far, if in one way, from that position that Heidegger required of us in getting attuned and jumping out of, springing out of the linear logic in the essay on identity and difference. You have to listen to this operation. You can't, if you look at it straight, you never find it. Or you foreclose it before getting to it. So there is this double turn. It's not simply saying objectivity is not possible. It's that the tools of objectivity or the tools for criticizing objectivities cannot be done away with. They are here in the first place, but also they are what we have. The point is, so there is no third external point. They are not claiming or hoping for any Archimedean point, yet another one that would allow revolutionizing everything and seeing the real truth of things. That's not what they are after. The notion of ground as ground now becomes the fact that we are staying with the question and we keep asking it and listening to how we ask it, listening to the possible consequences. And instead of thinking what something is, we start questioning what it might make matter. What, in that funny double meaning of also Dane just mentioned the point where particles start interacting and start making time and space, it will make matter, as in material matter, but also how this matters, how this has consequences, what does it entail. There is an immediate ethical color attached to the ontological question here, which is, I believe, very, very interesting, because it changes radically the attitude or the position of the figure of the researcher, scientist, and require far more to be open much more to philosophical questions straight away. But also, if we want, it is very much an artistic position. I mean, at least from my understanding of making art, I go to the studio as an image, and I don't have a studio, or don't need a studio for the kind of work I used to make. But I go to work to stay with the work, not to produce something that I already have in mind. I go to work, and then my staying with the work progressively produces outcomes, values, sometimes simultaneously, and I preserve them, but the intention is somehow opened up onto this flat level of, I'm not going to go from A to B, I want you to dwell in the process. You don't seem...
I do. I'm just thinking about what you're saying.
Sorry?
When I frown, it just means I'm thinking.
So it's a very different way of approaching, and it's a way that unsettles deeply the position of the scientist that wants to be sure of the tools that are available for working. And even when those tools are supposed to be problematic, they're problematic in principle, somehow in the introduction of the book, but then when you start working things out, you trust them, because otherwise you wouldn't really get anywhere. And I accept that, and it's fine. But from a philosophical reflection on the problem of how do we dwell, what's the logic that keeps us in relation with the place and able to act on the side, they apply this slowing down, resisting, not opposing, just resisting, so that other things can emerge, something else can resonate. Maybe it would end up being the same result, but it would not be reached blindfolded, sort of with blinkers on.
Would we ever simplify to say she's really talking about how scientists should go about their work, their method,
She's speaking of methodology, but she's
Yeah.
speaking of a methodology. You're right, but she's speaking of methodology about science, but it becomes a methodology for engaging with the environment in general.
Yes.
Her recent work is very much ecological.
Yeah.
She also another thing that comes up in her work in the latest description of complexity in this book, not in the work she's done with Ilya Prigogine in the 80s, where they worked out the technologies, the technique and technologies and mathematics of complexity and the immediate consequences for ontology back then, saying that the fundamental dimensions of complexity are nonlinearity and reversibility. Therefore, time is fundamental, and hence the Newtonian model based on the static background and the reversibility of events is no longer old. So that's what she did then. Now she's going forward, saying, what is happening here is that emergence itself is a concept that has emerged. It was not there originally, but what is more important is that because complexity is a science that spreads across disciplines and relates to the things that move, to the things that dissipate energy, was being studied in thermodynamics, in chemistry. It has to do with life, with the dynamics of what is called population system with a lot of elements, and can never be reduced to elementary particles. Is a science that subtracts the authority of physics as the ultimate science that reaches the thing itself. Physics wanted to have, still wants to have, the top position on the hierarchy of the sciences because it is the science of matter, the science of the cosmos. It wants to speak directly with philosophy and with theology. Is the queen of sciences. And instead, Stengers puts forward the notion of an ecology of practices that are all on the same level. So one dwells with the problem, spends time with it, suffers it at other times, resists its immediate application in order to allow all these different practices to get at the problem. She's in the art of modeling. She speaks of I believe it's in the art of modeling. She speaks of she speaks of science not making a difference between what is scientific and what is opinion, because that's not the issue. But wanting to have only one method of measurements applied, and as somehow she's saying science knows that method of measurements is arbitrary. Obviously, it is. It almost accepts that method of measurement could produce opinions. Science, physics, just wants its opinion to be ruling and doesn't allow space for the others. What she demands instead is that we allow that different questions coming in. And now you can hear what John has been repeating throughout the year. Where is the sexual in this kind of question? Where is the sensual? Where is the flesh? Where is the skin? Where is the dirt, the blood? All these things. As in, let's not allow the rational code of language after mathematics to be the only practice which we can, or the only methodology which we can use to question, or to go through life, to go to ethical, political, essential, aesthetic life, whichever, obviously everything is bound together. That attitude was the modern attitude. This is why, and this is the thing that Lyotard discusses about the space of representation. This is why I thought it was good to read them together in parallel. There's a lot to take in at once. He describes the space of painting that happens between the Renaissance and Cubism. And following a book that unfortunately is not translated in English by Frank Castel, the art historian from France, that is titled Figurative Space Between Renaissance and Cubism. And he follows that very closely in the way he develops the argument. He is saying that the onset of perspective in the 15th century produced a systematic change as radical as the breaking down of perspective at the end of the 19th century, turn of the last century with Cézanne and then the Cubism. The whole notion of representing space on two dimensions was based on an understanding of space structured geometrically and accessed visually in a very specific way, as according to a specific machine that he describes very well, very much in detail, which is analogous to parallel to the view of the universe of Newtonian classic science, which saw static background on it, and one way of approaching it, which is the mathematic representation that science uses. And they are questioning this. They are questioning this beyond the immediate notion of lack of ground or groundless ground. They are just saying that it's groundless ground somehow is not even any longer a problem. We know that we do not have a foundation. How do we use what we have? We've got to really listen, really be open to all the possibilities, to all the approaches available to us to this question. In other books, she writes of the difference between medicine, the physician, the doctor, and the charlatan, the pretending doctor. And she analyzes how they both work on. I didn't read that book, so I'm not. She mentions it several times in Cosmopolitics. Now they are both approaches that should not be mutually exclusive. That's what it is very important in what she brings forward. The whole point is that do not apply opposition any longer.
I had difficulty with this because I used to be a medic, and it's the use of the word charlatan there, isn't it? Because there are people out there with wacko type treatments who are basically defrauding people.
Oh yes.
And that's usually what I mean by a charlatan. So I assume that Stengers would agree that people like that should be excluded from the system.
Possibly so. I mean, I have not read that book, then I'm not
There are other
defending or
people
not defending it.
who have sort of methods of treatment which might appear weird, but until you can sort of carry out some kind of assessment.
Yes.
You
We're
can't
not
decide
speaking
whether
about the fraud or the
No.
honesty. No, it's not that. It's not that.
I just thought charlatan, because when I read it, I
Yeah.
thought charlatan was a poorly chosen word, because I think we'd all agree charlatans should be out, basically, because they do a lot of harm.
But does it resonate with you? Because you are or have been probably, you can never not be a medic.
I'm just feeling defensive.
But how do you hear this?
Well, I mean, the reason I sort of skipped through, and I don't think I actually sort of landed very much on the bit you're talking about on Stengers, was because I thought she was talking about the sort of philosophy about how science should be applied, and the politics between different branches of science, and between science and artists and all that sort of thing, which wasn't what I was interested in at the time. I was wanting to find out about quantum mechanics
Okay.
and complexity. But what I did feel she was saying was that most scientists wouldn't actually disagree with what she says, but they might not maintain their own standards. You know, there is a lot of interdisciplinary competition, and you know, the physicists want to be the sort of royal science because they used to be, and so a lot of what she says is very true. But I think if you pin them down in the corridor, they have to admit that what she says is right. It's just that they don't behave like that. And so, but there again, I'm not a scientist. I come from a medical background where everything was very interdisciplinary. You know, they were working together with different viewpoints.
But for example, she quotes very often Felix Guattari, who was a collaborator with Deleuze in the 80s and was a very, from my understanding, a peculiar kind of psychiatrist.
I think from the point of view of other I think all psychoanalysis is pretty actually, and from a sort of psychiatric background, he would have been seen as very weird, but only one amongst many, but not to be excluded, but to be sort of treated with caution, because he was on the lunatic fringe, put it that way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no,
But
it's...
it's where it happens, isn't it, on the fringe? So I think, and most practitioners are aware of that.
But I think that what you said is very interesting. Treated with caution. It is not as if, though. This is precisely what Stengers is proposing. That every position should be somehow treated with caution, including those that have been accepted until now as those that are certain. If one can inhabit that position, she thinks that we are in a much better place to do science and to do ethics, to relate to the world. There is another chapter where she speaks of tact as a way to, as a recommendation for the scientists, because the scientist is working out this. Well, it is where then she speaks of emergence being emerging. If you rush too quickly to conclusions, or to better to not to conclusions, but to apply the method that you have, the risk is to rule out too many things that potentially are very interesting, or potentially even creating damage. And this is built. I found rereading Barad yesterday after having read Stengers for today. It's very interesting how the modern method represented the world as in a relationship that was monologic. There was only one way of representing the world, and that was the mathematics. And that remains, begins with Descartes at the beginning of the 17th century, who says that mathematics is the language that God speaks, and remains throughout until one reaches Husserl at the beginning of the 20th century. He wrote a famous book titled The Crisis of European Sciences, where he says, well, we only deal with numbers, we never reach the thing itself. So now we are prisoners of our mathematical methodology. And that was contemporary to Cubism, or just shortly after that, in that moment where they view direct linear visual representation, where there is a subject and an object, as had been taken as certain. Not even the two is the way things are, and now this has been undone, and the Cubists, influenced by, can say, Picasso with the Demoiselle d'Avignon, working out sculptures from both Africa and prehistoric Spain, or them being influenced by relativity, probably all these things together, start questioning the fact that we are representing 3D on 2D. According to a method that we thought was certain, and actually it has been shaping reality for us a bit too much. And what is interesting in the description that Lyotard makes, it points the beginning of this crumbling of representation, visual representation with Cézanne. It is, I believe, accepted in art history that that's the point, because Cézanne does not do what the Impressionists do, which is looking at how the light bounces off the object. In other words, that implies that the object, the body, is still there, defined with the contour somehow, but we are looking at the light and the color the light takes. What Cézanne does is a kind of painting that constitutes the object on the canvas only when the viewer looks at it. So it's the phenomenon of the painting happens for the viewer. So there is a very change in the linearity of the visual representation. And the mathematical model of Descartes, and the way it is analyzed and described by Lyotard, becomes translated in a way of presenting on a two-dimensional surface a 3D world. So if if this is the surface seen a bit from the side, here we have the world, I don't know, there is somebody and the landscape behind, and this is literally projected onto it through the specific rules of perspective. And here there is the eye that sees it, and it comes back to it. So there is a code. So the code that is only one code for translating these into this one, so that the eye can see. And this line, eye, image, object. So this becomes a subject, and this is the object. Was the model of both visual representation, literally in fresco. This picture of length of Masaccio and the early, and now the pre-Renaissance did not deal with depth. If you look into the images of the text, it brings up images of the kind of painting from Siena in the late 14th century, and how the buildings are, you see inside the buildings, but it is as if you see inside a dollhouse. They are missing one wall, and then the background, which is supposed to be the outside, is just a solid color. So there is no depth. Also, inside outside is completely different than what we've been used to see or to think in the following painted follow. But to reach these perspective solution to represent the world, the invention of the perspective machine that Leon Battista Alberti did was fundamental. That was a code, and then was somehow ontologized about a century later by Descartes, century and a half later by Descartes. Art is always there first. But and that says that there is a mathematics, a code exactly like this system, like this technology, for representing the world. And this has been a very, very powerful tool, and it still is a very powerful tool.
Can I just start, you talking about single point perspective, is that what you mean?
Yeah, but then it's also multiplied. Leonardo, I didn't know that. I just found out while I was reading him. Uses multiple perspective to add, and then he starts using color. Leonardo is the one that starts thinking, how can I give the notion, the impression of distance? Because the whole notion of veduta here is that this becomes actually a cube within which the whole action happens. Sorry, this is not perfectly cube. And it's an architecture in which there is generally the nativity or whatever else. The topic obviously is almost always religious. But then these spaces always have, or start having, and then they have it all the time, a window at the back or on the sides, on which you see outside. And that outside is what remains non-captured by this machine, says Lyotard, and it's sort of right. But then there is a problem how to give depth to that too, to give distance, because now the problem that has happened, we'll get back to it in a second, is that the world has depth and the representation of the world has depth, but this is outside the perspective machine also because it is organic stuff, it's no longer architecture, so how do you present that? And that's where Leonardo, among others, starts working with color and figures out that the mountains in the distance tends to be blue, pale and blue because of the air, the oxygen, so he paints them like that. And that's, for Lyotard, this is what remains inevitably order of what has been captured by the rationality of language and mathematics in painting. And it's funny, well, when I say funny, put in between quotation, I am annoyed, because that order is nature, is the sensual, is not the architecture, the rationalized architecture of the civilized language of the city, is something else. And why should be that? That's in itself an assumption that I find difficult to digest. But this order can be created because that from that disorder of the great ephemeral skin, where steering wheels, chairs, breasts, lips are all floating next to each other, so it was a monodimensional flat thing. There is what Lyotard called thickness that is taking place. There is a distancing being set in by the machine representation. A hierarchy in spatial distance, in sciences, where there is always an organization that is fundamentally spatialization. Is that the word of pronounce? The way we pronounce it? Spatialization, installation of space, and therefore in a linear space, which is understood to be organized by geometry, and that changes a lot the narratives of medieval space, which had a number of paths but never took in the space as a whole. I don't know if any of you ever read a book that is not particularly serious but helps in understanding these differences. I believe it's called the Chant Way or the Chant Paths of Bruce Chatwin about Australian Aboriginal cultures. Don't read it, it's not important, but it is, it's good for an example. No, it's just one of those upper class British travellers that write about the journey, the trips. But he is looking at the Aboriginal paintings, which look abstract to us, but are actually paths that we call mythological narratives. An object presented on 2D, they look like funny spirals or things like this. They don't have much meaning because they don't relate to a space that is mapped a priori. So you see how the onset of the post-modern, or the crisis of the modern, brings to the surface, to the fore, how much everything was organized from a visual perspective, from the ideology that we look at things and things exist in space that is was taken as static, as a stage for events to happen. If we now fast forward to Stengers, she has not even she doesn't even have a problem with these or another model. She just said, okay, let's dwell in it, see what we can do with that, what it can take us, and also what problems it might generate, what advantages or what problems. Just see the consequences, see what it makes matter. So in different situations, the same solution, the same problem can be positive or negative, for example. I take from these stance, which is very interesting because it really turns around. It forces us to question constantly all the choices one makes. So the ontology becomes ethical and subtracts authority to those focus points that have it in a different paradigm.
You mean because of choice? Did you say didn't say moral? You said ethical. Did you?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So choice becomes very much more important than knowledge, which does not mean that one does not need knowledge to choose, but
it's choice is involved with action or inaction,
exactly.
Isn't it? So,
exactly.
And in the process of making art, one's facing that constantly, all the time.
Yes. So it's.
So you are, because that was interesting. Me, sorry from sidetracking, that idea of the dwelling thing, and going right back to where you were talking about how a way of making art is to sort of be with it, not to have a preconceived or not preconceived, not to have an aim. I want it to look like that. However, even the want it to look like that choice. Has to involve dwelling to get there.
Of course, but one can somehow put oneself in the position of a distance of subject-object and wanting to produce something. I was speaking earlier with Simon. I was saying my approach is that I ask, what can I do with these things? Not I want to make these, therefore I go out and get the camera or the brush or the installation in order to get to that result. Right? So to open myself up to whatever I encounter, and sort of see what dimension I have possibilities it has, and try to multiply those, make them resonate until something like an interesting question comes out of it. Or
but say you have an interesting question, and that. Before you start working,
but you can throw it at things and see what comes out.
That is what you follow.
Yeah.
through the making
Yeah.
or not making
Mhm.
or reading or whatever it is you choose to do.
Well, Heidegger in a question concerning technology makes this point for Aristotle. It's the questioning that builds the way.
Mm-hmm.
The questioning gives the sort of direction rather than the result or anything else like that. It's how you position yourself to ask a question, and when you ask that question, things start to reveal themselves to you, and things start to open up and give you sort of a way to manoeuvre through whatever it is that's around you.
Like a scientific hypothesis.
I was just going to say that, I mean, this is really good science, because if you ever go, you have to go to a lot of them, certain communities, onto a symposium on experimental method, that's the first thing, what's the right question? And not to leap to the conclusions. I mean, it's said in perhaps a slightly different way, but they're saying the same things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they may not be doing them, but I would have thought someone who lectures on scientific technique would have to agree with what Stengers says. I don't think
I mean, she does very fine analysis of specific claim and specific experiments, and she follows them. She also mentions, I read this book, the Cosmopolitan one, a few years back, and I was quite surprised. She quotes another scholar called something Cartwright, is Elizabeth Cartwright, something like that. And she was a philosopher of science who starts having the doubt about what kind of logic are the scientists applying when they do experiments, especially in physics, that are supposed not to follow our linear Newtonian logic of day-to-day life. So she studied physics, and she reconstructed the experiments as they were made. And she found that even when one is dealing with things that aren't at the same time, so they don't respond to linear logic of identity and non-contradiction, they actually apply that logic throughout the experiment. So there is such a strange flow of...
well, if you have 100 variables,
mm-hmm.
and you nudge one of them,
Mm-hmm.
they all move and you don't know what you're
Exactly.
doing. So what you do is you nail down 98 of them,
And then you play
move
with
one and measure the last one. And of course that tells you very little, but at least you know if there is a cause and effect where that was. But it tells you nothing about the other 98. And I think most sort of experimental scientists, if there is such a person, would accept that, but that seems to be the only way forward.
No, but it's the only way practicable.
And the other ways are statistical methods with complexity and that sort of thing. The statistical methods don't prove anything, that's the problem.
But at the same time, when you deal with very, very large numbers of particles, then the probability is so high that in practical terms equals certainty.
Yes, that's right. But I mean, I think the thing is that there are reductive methods which are chosen purposely, and it's correct to choose them, I would say. And then for other, it's tools for the trade. Everybody tends to assume that scientists just use reductive methods all the time.
No, I see what you mean. I don't think this is what Stengers is saying either. She aims. Take for example the analysis she makes of the neutrino. Is this particle that is created. First, it's discovered mathematically, but discovered is quite sort of a delicate term because mathematics somehow presupposes that this particle should be there, according to what has been already found. Then experiments are constructed to find this specific particle, so they're finely tuned, geared to that. So you could say that you interfere with too much. Then finally, this particle, which is a particle that manifests itself very rarely, so it's very difficult to repeat the experiment in the first place, appears in the constricted control condition of the laboratory.
And the Hadron Collider is an example.
Something like that.
Build an enormous machine to find
She
one
does speak about the big science somewhere, well, exactly. And then what is amazing is that it manifests itself, not only with all the properties that we're supposed to have mathematically, but it manifests itself as inevitably and necessarily there in order to support everything that has been already proved or discovered. So, Stengers says this is not to be taken as a paradox that shows us a mistake or a ground scan that should make us throw us our hands up. But that's it. I'm going home. It's it's very interesting. We have just to stay with this, to stay with this problem. The fact that the more, for us, the more this particle is something that appears to have been constructed by us, the more it somehow builds strength at the other end as existing in itself. And this is a very interesting thing. She does not want to close this problem. So this is where she's sort of in opening up the ethical side of the scientific, epistemological, ontological question. And she's somehow saying that without this side, the ontological question is reductive. It's reductive as in cuts off many other parts that are fundamental, but also cannot be but a reductive paradigm that wants to bring things always down to basic logical axioms, and that's that. So there is, you're absolutely right in saying that scientists will not reject what she says. She's sort of dealing with the image that science produces of itself.
Yeah.
The image that science produces of itself so that it can receive money, for example. Or the image that science has and is used in politics in order to sell us or to convince us that it is good to cut the forest or it's not good to cut the forest, whatever it is.
I mean, there's a situation at the moment where universities have to, in order to get their money, they have to publish in reputable journals, this, that, and the other. And so it's publish or be done, basically. So they have to get results, and that's putting immense pressure on them to not cut corners exactly, but to certainly choose what they research in, and also to get the job done in the sense that you're speaking of it. Take it slowly is not what they're
It's
forced
not
to do.
what the politics of science are demanding.
Well, that's the politics of politics. It's not the politics of science, and the scientists are all screaming about it.
But not only the scientific, we are suffering the same problem.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, the fact that the humanities have been denied all public money since the new law introduced by the coalition 5 years ago, is precisely a sign of this, of the mentality that there is a privileged branch of knowledge and a superfluous one. I remember there were discussions around the time which made me furious, even already before, where they were saying, the old people called for, it didn't matter which side of the spectrum they were, they all more or less agreed. They were discussing if the plumber needed to know Shakespeare or not. And the thing related, the slogan was, we need more plumbers and less teachers of English literature. As if the plumber, decided the plumber can enjoy Shakespeare like anybody else. I don't see why he shouldn't or she shouldn't, really. But the plumber will not have one day to go to vote, therefore he has to be able to make up her mind or his mind. And if it only has studied plumbing, he won't be able to do that. He needs to have read philosophy and history and know art, to have the refined sensitivity to decide, to choose and decide. Obviously, the plan is to have a nation of efficient technicians, which is the modern version of servants. So,
That's precisely why, though, isn't it? So that nobody will question.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I promise it's the last thing I'll say, but
Well, it's fine, isn't it?
there was an issue a few years ago. You're giving me permission to have a sort of quiet life. The situation a few years ago was no one was training in scientific subjects, and it just, the pendulum seems to have swung back the other way, doesn't it? And they tried to get everybody to take up scientific subjects because everybody was taking up, I don't know, philosophy of art and sort of media economy or something, and open university degrees in sociology and all the sort of jokes that went round. So they said, right, got to get them to do maths, physics, and so it's just swung that way, hasn't it? And
worked really well. The number of people who did STEM courses just shot up. It's been crazy. Like the number of people that did maths at uni was really small, and then must have been a couple of years ago, it just went through the roof, and people have been throwing money at STEM courses and things now.
because that's how to get the money into the university.
Then
Sorry,
following
I'll
that,
shut
there's
up.
there's sort of a surfeit of scientists then who are kind of sitting around waiting for corporate money, and you have a
Yes.
whole sort of institution with
If
scientists for hire.
if you want to, Stengers wrote about this in the. She speaks of colonizing practices, and that's precisely what she's talking about. There is a short essay of hers in The Speculative Term, where because she uses the word speculative as her approach, she's being associated with speculative realism, but she's got nothing to do with it because they are neo-Cartesians, and she's absolutely not a neo-Cartesian.
They're all in disagreement with each other anyway, aren't they, to be honest.
That's probably true, but I just find, because since I like her, I am annoyed that she's been sort of bangled up with that lot. But she's speaking exactly precisely this. It's not the problem of colonizing science where physics per se has genuine curiosity, the passion, the passion for the law, she calls it, wants to know. That's absolutely fine, but we want that. Is when it is submitted to corporate money for specific kind of investigation. So it takes away the curiosity, which takes away the same thing we enjoy in the art side.
That's what came through from her talk, because I remember thinking about this when I left. That, because I remember thinking that there's only a certain amount of PhDs that you can do, because if there's something that you want to research and there's no money available for it, you have to do it. You have to fund it yourself, because nobody wants to or needs to know about that thing, which isn't necessarily true. It's just that there's nobody that wants to give money towards it.
Yeah, but also that means that
So you've shown them
potentially
they want to know
very,
about it.
Yeah.
potentially very important or very interesting things
Yeah.
are not studied, therefore not discovered, because, for example, Big Pharma does not have an interest in developing. This is a practical problem. Antibiotics are becoming progressively less effective because we use too much of them. And, but there is no money at the moment to be made, so there is no research done. Certainly when we start dying of flu again, then there will be a lot of money to be made and they will rush into it. But so this is the kind of problems where this is what she calls it cosmopolitics. Like the way we organize our epistemology has an impact not only discussing if Galileo did well or not in his debate with the Pope. He was actually a friend with the Pope, that saved his neck. Because otherwise, so he was only forbidden to publish, and rather than being jailed and probably killed.
Is that the problem that it's a political problem, isn't it, as well? Because in a sense, that the people that are sort of whinging about the scientists, they're victims as well of the sort of politics.
Is she anti-institutional?
To the extent to which a professor in university can be asked anti-institutional, to the extent to somebody who has worked with the biggest scientist in Europe in the 80s can be anti-institutional. I wouldn't say she's anti. She's not anti. She just says we resist the blind application of the model. It's a very, very interesting position to be in. If you what you have presented this afternoon, and the fact that my question about why did you choose to use film on film, and it was somehow dictated by this curiosity. Why should one up now do everything digital and vice versa? Why should one reject? I don't know. Just keep it open and see where it can take you. And it took you to a very interesting place. So. Is that proposal that I think is valid across the board? It's not only for scientists. I mean, she's focusing on that, but she was calling on artists to participate to her concerns. Very, very lively in that speech.
I think institutions, they welcome a few mavericks, don't they, and a few people to challenge the system. They value it.
A good institute.
Well, it depends. I mean, some people
As
are
long as
just
there's not too many.
destructive. Exactly, they can be very destructive.
I don't think that, but I think that's one or two, but
I don't know, you need 3% or something.
Well, also because
There's a weird tension between it, isn't it? Because I think most scientists or whatever would sort of realise that, like you said, Nick, that advancement and progress is made like on the fringes. It's made by people doing things they shouldn't really and mucking around and stuff, and yet that quickly gets sucked back in, and it's a weird.
But
it's
that's
an odd
exactly the
sort
same
of
as it
balance.
happens with art, doesn't it? You break away from what has been done so far, mostly because you're bored with it, or your curiosity takes you somewhere else, or you have a different story to tell. And then it is the system of art, like no order, because it's a capitalist system, absorbs all differences.
Yeah.
It takes away your ability to be disruptive by turning you into a commodity or spectacle or both, or consumable at least. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, I found I'm more comfortable in studying than else, and I probably find that this too somehow is flattened. But the working in order to exhibit in a gallery was inherently the pride of his cutting edge, because there was always something that some reaction that very quickly would just make it be, yes, just yet another thing. Anything has been done, anything is fine, whatever. But it's not just if you floats your balls fine, then you start working outside that, so you can really not be appropriated, captured, that's what the word is, by that structure. I think it's really good to read one passage, at least, of Karen Barad, but also today, I think the beginning closes at 8 o'clock. I forgot to say at the beginning, so we don't have a terrible amount of time. Anybody who's feeling like reading?
I've got your book for you.
I actually have my own copy.
Where is it?
I'm reluctant to get it out.
It's all right, you can go away.
Anyone?
Yeah.
You're all pretending not to listen to my question.
Oh, sorry.
Does anybody want to read?
How much
It
is
makes-
there to read?
It makes no difference whether I listen to it or not.
This short one here, that's
I'll
fine.
end up doing it.
And then
Is there a page?
in Karen Barad, yes, page 71, the quote from Donna Haraway. And then on page 90, down to half page 91.
Do you want to? Look, it's going to come to you. Do you want to? If you don't want to, I'll do it.
Well, just in the
Okay, Amrit, you read the quote from Karen.
yeah,
From
in the
Donna
interest
Haraway.
of diversity.
What, this one?
Kind of what we're talking about.
Okay.
Give it to Simon. It's what we've always done. Just do that.
You are paranoid, but with good reason.
Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean you're all not out to get me.
No, we are up to get.
Okay. Chapter 2. Diffractions, differences, contingencies and entanglements that matter. Reflexivity has been recommended as a critical practice, but my suspicion is that reflexivity, like reflection, only displaces the same elsewhere, setting up worries about copy and original, and the search for the authentic and really real. What we need is to make a difference in material semiotic apparatuses, to diffract the rays of technoscience so that we get more promising interference patterns on the recording films of our lives and bodies. Diffraction is an optical metaphor for the effort to make a difference in the world. Diffraction patterns record the history of interaction, interference, reinforcement, difference. Diffraction is about heterogeneous history, not about originals. Unlike reflections, diffractions do not displace the same elsewhere in more or less distorted form. Rather, diffraction can be a metaphor for another kind of critical consciousness at the end of this rather painful Christian millennium, one committed to making a difference and not to repeating the sacred image of same. Diffraction is a narrative, graphic, psychological, spiritual and political technology for making consequential meanings. Was that it? That was it, wasn't it?
What do you hear in it? You know what diffraction is. I assume there are a couple of images in here. One is the diffraction interference, the sound waves propagating and interfering with their motion. Can you see from? And or the waves going through, water going through a small passage, which she shows here. But what it becomes interesting in the other example she brings out is light shown through a razor blade, and you probably can't see that far, but the shadow of the blade, instead of, if this is a monophase light, so one color, the shadow of the light is not a sharp shadow, here is dark, here is light. It starts multiplying. There are first the body of shadow ends, then there is line of light, then there is another line of shadow, then another line of light, and it continues fractally to the center of the cut, and outside as well. So it does resonate and interfere, creating other patterns, and that's where this is why it becomes an interesting, as she says, an interesting metaphor. This thing.
It is a metaphor.
It is a metaphor. She does claim it. She does claim it.
Thank God.
Well, I thought it was getting really weird for a while. Sorry.
She's not hiding that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but that's it's not an actual, it's not a metaphor in terms of what light does.
No, but it's a metaphor in terms of what she's doing.
as a methodology, epistemological methodology, it is. But it
it's
is a
not-
metaphor
it's-
that wants to.
It's not what I'd call a true metaphor, though, is it? Because she is suggesting we use that approach in what we're doing. So it's not
Yes, but we're not suggesting it's a wave motion.
what the logic that we're using.
No, I believe it is right.
Yes, and what she's saying is we should, because diffraction happens when you have waves interfering with one another. And what she's saying is you read through each other's theoretical approaches, and in some cases they supplement one another, and in other places they sort of tend to argue with each other. So you get the, but that's a metaphor.
Well, no, it's not. That's what actually happens.
No, people aren't talking in wave motion, are they?
Well, okay, all right. If you're going to be that literal about
Well,
it,
that's
then-
what a metaphor is.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Yeah.
But at the same time, she's saying that it is very interesting to see how, if a single wave from one stone thrown into the pond spreads out, has some consequences, but somehow rather self-similar, linear, not predictable in a way. It becomes interesting when these consequences either meet other limits, the edges of the pond, or other consequences, other waves stemming from another stone thrown into that, because that creates very interesting interactions, and that's where the interesting stuff exists. So that, yes, it is absolutely, I think she's fine with that, but she's also saying this is an interesting tool to look at things in a different way.
Yes, and you get areas of agreement between very different approaches. That's what
Yes.
Stengers is talking
Yeah.
about, isn't it, without calling it diffraction.
Yes. And if another voluntary reader wants to go to page 90,
Sounds like
Can lend my book.
Heavy breathing.
Where am I reading to?
from the page 90 at the bottom of the diagram
Thing.
to halfway through page 91.
First and foremost, as Haraway suggests, a diffractive methodology is a critical practice for making a difference in the world. It is a commitment.
Slow, because it's next. So.
It is a commitment to understanding which differences matter, how they matter, and for whom. It is a critical practice of engagement, not a distance learning practice of reflecting from afar. The agential realist approach that I offer eschews representationalism and advances a performative understanding of techno-scientific and other natural cultural practices, including different kinds of knowledge-making practices. According to agential realism, knowing, thinking, measuring, theorizing, and observing are material practices of interacting within and as part of the world. What do we learn by engaging in such practices? We do not uncover pre-existing facts about independently existing things as they exist frozen in time, like little statues positioned in the world. Rather, we learn about phenomena, about specific material configurations of the world's becoming. The point is not simply to put the observer or knower back in the world, as if the world were a container and we needed merely to acknowledge our situatedness in it, but to understand and take account of the fact that we too are part of the world's differential becoming. And furthermore, the point is not merely that knowledge practices have material consequences, but that practices of knowing are specific material engagements that participate in reconfiguring the world. Which practices we enact matter, in both senses of the word. Making knowledge is not simply about making facts, but about making worlds, or rather, it is about making specific worldly configurations. Not in the sense of making them up ex nihilo, or out of language, beliefs or ideas, but in the sense of materially engaging as part of the world in giving it specific material form. And yet the fact that we make knowledge not from outside but as part of the world does not mean that knowledge is necessarily subjective, a notion that already presumes the pre-existing distinction between object and subject that feeds representationalist thinking. At the same time, objectivity cannot be about producing undistorted representations from afar. Rather, objectivity is about being accountable to the specific materializations of which we are a part. And this requires a methodology that is attentive to and responsible to the specificity of material entanglements in their agential becoming. The physical phenomenon of diffraction makes manifest the extraordinary liveliness of the world.
Is it a good use of a metaphor?
The diffraction
Yes,
one?
that was very, yes, I think it is. The thing that I just noticed there, she used entanglement, didn't she?
Yes.
She does talk about entanglement.
Yes.
But she wasn't using it in a sort of quantum context.
No, she uses it as in you are inseparable
Yes.
from the world you live in.
Yeah. So,
But they insist here. You might remember when we started at the beginning of the year, we had one or two seminars on Kant, critical pluralism, and the transcendental aesthetic. Now, if you remember, Kant is the one that makes the transition from thinking that space and time are out there, and says space and time are form of our intuition, of our perception. So whatever is out there comes to us as a raw data, and we shape it and organize it through space and time. So then that becomes experience. We don't really have access to the raw data outside. It wouldn't make any sense to us. We need to package it somehow, and then it's taken in, and then it's further packaged with the categories of intellect and the ideas of reason. Now, this notion that the form of space and time are forms of our intuition got Kant to be criticized endlessly because they said, well, actually, you're not. This is complete idealism. You're saying that we are making the world up. The world doesn't exist otherwise. Which is not. I don't take it that it's a bit too literary a reading, but fair enough. Let's leave it there. What she's saying now here about this entanglement is coming up is that it's the same problem of the neutrino that Stan just discussed, that I mentioned earlier. That you cannot expect or even imagine that the object is there as a priori they might exist, and I exist a priori of my object. Nor you can imagine any longer that there is a unique and true method that can translate that object into the subject. In a certain way, the whole process is the object of study, is the whole ground on which we stand. And jumping back to the other chapter I thought we should read, the power of reason, what is called, the one about the invention of mechanics and the power of reason. In that, there's a shorter chapter titled The Lagrangian Event. Stengers, she's not the only one, but she insists very much that the possibility of measuring, the fact that we introduce a unit of measure that allows us to give value, position, name to this otherwise completely fluid and mixed surface where everything float next to each other. That possibility of measure is an event. That's an organization of the world. There is a whole world coming into shape, falling into place when you have the possibility of measuring, no matter what unit of measure you use. In the case of the modern world, was mathematics, and which organized and conceived space as Euclidean geometry. Now that can break down, you can have other options, but you always have this event of the possibility of measuring. And now, what Barad is mentioning here is that, I believe Stengers agrees with her, is that that possibility is the material we're working with, that possibility is our ground, that possibility is the object. So we stay with that. That's the critical approach she's suggesting we take. Because wanting to do away with that entirely would leave us literally nowhere. Would just take away any possibility, any language to use. Instead, one uses the language one has and uses critically, listens to it. You see how it's very interesting because it opens up from the epistemological angle, it opens up to a number of other directions which, not including one bundle because it puts everything together, but reassembles all the different line of questioning, the ethic, the political, the aesthetic, the ontological, redistributes them from another center of questioning. I find it's very interesting as a position. Do you hear it in some similar way, or
It's not about integrating, all different kind of methods into each other and hovering over that.
No, it's not integrating them as in merging them into one thing.
No, what kind of a little bit, and just to explore different possibilities, different methods.
No, not exactly.
It's having the broad picture, isn't it, about trying to keep your mind open to all possibilities.
It's different than having a broader picture, because a broader picture will still fall into this notion of, well, if I stand back enough, I can see everything and grasp it, comprehend it.
Right.
One of the problem, the reason why I say this is that one of the problems that the Cartesian understanding of mathematization of geometry, space as geometry came and brought up, was that geometrical shapes could be intuitively thought only if they had a limited number of sides or of angles. A shape with 1,000 corners would not be, you cannot imagine it in your mind, therefore you cannot work out all of the geometrical, whatever functions, unless you draw it. Again, if you draw it, it's almost impossible. So algebra comes along, the calculus, in order to represent these in a different way, and be able to give you a way to access the limit, the edge of that mental object, because otherwise you couldn't contain it. So the stepping back always requires another ground on which to stand. So in your sentence, you said two things: stepping back to a broader picture, and then something else, which was.
Well, what I meant by broader picture was taking different viewpoints into consideration, and not choosing one, but keeping your options open. If you like. That's what I meant by broad picture.
But how do you ever draw a conclusion to something if you're always open?
Very legitimate question.
Well, you can draw conclusions and still keep your mind open, can't you? You can say, well, it looks like this, but possibilities.
By that logic, you never exhaust anything. You never really get to the end of anything.
Well, you're in danger of shutting down options by if you're saying, well, we've got to do something.
Yeah.
You might end up having to do something, but you can still keep your mind open to other possibilities, even though you've just done it.
Well, I suppose what I meant was that you never really kind of exhaust it in its multiple form. You never have something in its entirety.
But the whole notion of a conclusion in itself is a product of that linear way of thinking that we've always done.
And at the same time, what Amrit just said is that notion of transcendental that Kant had put forward. You never exhaust the possibilities of something because that thing in itself is problematic. We use it as a regulative idea because it is useful to have it for our way of thinking, but we have no information about its existence. And that problematic thing is the reason for the world to be, God, as in English of course, the human freedom, the autonomy of the subject, and the whole of the world as in the cosmos, or the whole of nature as a unity, the necessity of causality. These three things are what can never be reached So you can never be exhausted. You can see plenty of phenomena with cause effect, but you never see causality per se, and so forth. So you're absolutely right in that.
The skill is being able to choose your approach while keeping all your options open, isn't it? I mean, you have to do both what I was saying and what you were saying. Focus in, but stay aware, sort of.
Is that where he was talking about the kind of setting a boundary, but it being boundless? That kind of.
Being finite but boundless.
Yeah, that was it.
We were speaking about that 1 or 2 seminars ago.
It sounds similar.
It sounds similar. It's not. It's not exactly the same thing, but it does go in. It is. I see what you're asking.
Operates in a similar way.
It's not being finite but boundless. It's more about a logic, the limits of a logic. No, but you're right, because if we think of it in terms of the axioms that Gödel finds are not ground, this is what we looked at last time, then you have a territory opened up by those axioms. And when I use territory, I use it technically. It's a conceptual and physical space organized in a certain way. But then you can never justify all that will happen, and more can happen. And if you want to justify that more, you will have to add more axioms. So it's finite in some sense, it's not infinite, but it's open. It's never fully justifiable. And that's, in a certain way, is a way of thinking that this that we are reading now somehow has probably gone through this type of girdle to get where it is. To undermine the certainty of objectivity, one needs to understand also from a mathematical point of view why objectivity is not possible, because otherwise we have the image in our mind that mathematics can be infinitely precise, and instead the Gödel shows it's not. You always need a more powerful system to justify the inferences you're using in order to make them work. But the more powerful system is an infinite regression. It's like exactly what is why I was replying to you saying, having a broader view, then requires another position where you can have a broader view than a broader view in order to justify a broader view, and then you go backward to infinity to reach.
Is that why you have to dwell? You have to stay with what
Yes.
you have.
So
You
instead
can't.
of going, looking for the final boundary, just keep where you are and use it all and let it be, let it speak to you.
I think that's what I'm saying. Actually.
No, you are, but I just picked onto the expression just to be to make sure you're clear.
It's almost as if when you are in that dwelling moment, as soon as you find yourself applying any sort of method at all, just stop it.
I mean, it's not that. I mean, it's not that you have to stop it, because obviously then you would do nothing.
Because then you
Well,
just be
you
applying
think-
a stopping method.
But you have to sort of retain the awareness that all these choices have implications and are also closing off orders, especially from.
So this is like the very nature of fractals then, where it kind of it's got a structure but it's still endless. Well, you know the video we saw on your week fractals, that's like a metaphor?
Yes. No. Actually, I remember the video, but no, it's
We're
not
all
the same
at it.
structure of fractals. Fractals are a logic of iteration, of repetition.
I would have thought it's because even though you're keeping all your options open, your options are never self-similar. So you can't have a fractal logic to it. Because every root.
But you're right, Ash, in the terms that fractals. I mean, this makes sense. I'm not saying that you ask a question that is up in the air. You remember when we looked at fractals, the problem of how long is the coast of Britain, or how big is the surface of a sponge, where you can wrap it into a piece of cloth and it's this wide, but if you wanted to open up all the inner hollowness, you probably have something as big as this table or even more. And depending on the unit of measure you adopt, that's the surface is potentially infinite. Depending on the unit of measure, you create an event, you give it a size, because then you limit the length of it. So in that sense, we can speak of something that is finite, but boundless, or not without boundary. But what they are speaking of here, especially when making knowledge is not simply about making facts, but about making words, or rather about making specific wordly configurations. It actually, if I pick one unit of measure versus another, I then organize the word one way or another. In that sense, they are speaking of it. So, you remember 1 month ago now, we read Lyotard, the first seminar on Lyotard, the Divisional Economy, before we had the chorus reading with Johnny, the week before. Well, both actually. The concept that Lyotard is putting forward is that there is, and that it comes back in Deleuze and Guattari and the notion of the horizon, is that there is this continuity, undifferentiated continuity, where everything is, but has no order. So nothing can take place, not even our understanding. We don't even exist in that continuous disorder, because one has a nose floating next to a shoe, floating next to a car tire, floating next to a banker. It's not. No, there is nothing can happen. You need to insert into that thing interruptions and impossible passages, or equal signs and different signs, so that some things will stay together, other will not. And therefore you need to go around to get somewhere else. So you have already created a space. You have created time, because it will take time to go around through the passages, avoiding all interruptions, for example. So you create an economy. If you introduce equal signs, things are exchangeable, but not all things are exchangeable. Therefore you need to close them down. This is making wordly configurations that have consequences. The criticism of a blind acceptance of capitalism as a culture is deeply in this kind of argument that we are proposing. And in fact, everything should be quantifiable, commodifiable, for both and soul. That things that very, very little things, especially in an art school. After all, now, can you study? Yes, only if you get a scholarship, only if it costs this much, like what we were saying before. So, for the yes.
It's a bit chicken and the egg, though, isn't it?
It is a chicken and the egg.
Because our consciousness emerged out of that, but yet our consciousness is the very thing that is imposing those limits on the thing that we've just instantaneously emerged out of, if you see what I mean.
Yes, but it's not the consciousness that imposes that. Is a paradigm of thinking.
And what's the difference?
What's the difference between conscious and paradigm of thinking? Well,
is a paradigm of thinking something that a consciousness does?
Yes.
Okay.
Paradigm of thinking is, you can take it in many different ways, but Newtonian classic physics that thinks that everything can be reduced to elementary atoms, which are the ground. There's nothing smaller than that, and these are solid little balls like marbles. And then thinks that everything that happens because of clashes of these atoms that hit each other like marbles or billiard balls and then go in this direction, that direction. Sees these clashes as deterministic, fair enough, therefore predictable, therefore envisions the possibility of an external absolute point of view that can have a total picture of all the positions and all the directions of these marbles at any given time, and therefore predict what is going to happen in the future and potentially just revert the velocity and maybe go into the past. That's a paradigm. This paradigm is shattered with the advent of thermodynamics that shows that not only that the absolute position is a dream, we cannot calculate that, but that systems with very large particles don't behave like that. They behave according to probability. Even the system itself, if it could have a mind, would not know. Somehow.
Yeah, but to be aware of all of that, we would need to have the limits in place to start with, but we're the ones
Yeah, but this is all the work of Deleuze and Guattari, which Stengers picks up a lot upon, is precisely around, Guattari being this on the fringe psychiatrist, is precisely working around the idea of the subject being an individuation. Sort of, if you think of having a cloth over this table and you pick it up somewhere, it's continuous, it's all the same color, you pick it up somewhere, you pull it up a bit, it starts being creased and stands up because you creased it, it comes up, it stays together. That's the subject, is the coming together of all these mixed things, indifferentiated, is an interruption, is a disjuncture. They all, if one wants to reduce the passage from a modern paradigm of thinking to a postmodern paradigm of thinking, and what follows, is that the modern looked at the order of the things in the lulls of the storm, where things were calm, and how the distribution was. And the postmodern shifts their attention onto the hinges between situation and situation, onto the passages. This is why, for example, Lyotard and Discourse Figures spend so much time looking at how the modern set in and how we then broke out of it. Doesn't really look much at the modern itself. It's all about hinges because they all distribute. The fixed distribution doesn't hold water anymore. So how are we moving? How does this come into place, and how are we moving? Not out of the place, because there is no out of the place. We are just shifting to a new one. That's the whole game of things that are deterritorialized while being reterritorialized at the same time. They go quite a length on it in a book on Kafka, Deleuze and Guattari, where they speak about the use of German by of the Jewish minority in Prague, and now it becomes a tool of resistance because it's used against the grain.
It's a nightmare, isn't it? Thought of Deleuze and Guattari and writing on Kafka.
But that kind of things that are interesting is when they retain a bit too much traditional ontology that we find problematic. And I'm not. I'm just trying to describe what.
But Deleuze, Guattari, and Lyotard, they're not saying it shouldn't sort of differentiate and.
No, they're just saying this is the way it is.
That's the way it is, and then you have to sort of get the balance right. Again.
Yes.
Because if you don't differentiate and turn the bar or whatever it is, then you get nowhere basically.
Yeah.
It just stays energy.
Well, there wouldn't be anything to differentiate with it. That's sort of.
Actually, it sounds quite good, doesn't it? Right at this moment.
Well, it does. Yeah.
So the major difference is that they move from the word conceived as a here and a there, a subject and an object, or a concept and an object, which is more or less the same thing. Two things taking place on a stage that pre-exists. Therefore, you can't apply the equation to describe how they are. You have an equal sign. This stands for that. There is an object and its proper name. There is a body and its soul. There is a universe and its God-logic that holds it up. And that's one way of presenting it. And I say, well, it's no longer giving us good results. It has been put into doubt by a lot of discoveries in science and many other things. One logic must be in function, otherwise the thing wouldn't stay together. The thing would constantly disgregate. So what is this logic? And they come up with, taking it from Heidegger, the idea of a groundless ground, something that is self-supporting, that happens through distributions that take place on an otherwise non-distributed it. Seems you're sort of finishing the last with a bit of skepticism.
No,
It's trying to understand it, isn't it? It's trying to get your head around it. Because
it does make sense, but it seems to me like it's just kind of, it's all circular and looping back on itself, which I'm sort of getting a sense of that's kind of fine, and that's sort of precisely what they mean, and that's just the way it is.
Yes.
So it's just my linear 19th century head.
But we are all thinking, and as soon as we leave the door, we go back to think like that. That's
Yeah,
that's the beauty or the problem, or both things at the same time.
It's just like, well, it's sort of like Ash was saying, you know, damn it, I want a beginning and an end. Just to make it nice and easy for me to
Subject to
understand.
logic.
Who I was talking to today about Nietzsche doing away with beginning and end and only keeping the truth.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
And
if
just
they like
keeping
it.
the middle.
Yeah. It's about.
It's all about the middle.
He doesn't have a start and end, does he? Because he's
Who,
always.
Nietzsche?
Yeah. Because he's just always ill and not ill. And it's just that going up and down. There's never a period where he's just. Like, there's no beginning and end to that.
He was a big fan of walking, Nietzsche, for that reason, because it was just the never arriving thing, just sort of did it in practical terms. It was just like,
Yeah, but it's because they all point
plus he was very ill and it helped.
of identity existed in the differentiation, and that remains in Heidegger, and that continues in this idea of disjunction or individuation, which are the same thing. You can only be you are, progressively moving away from an indifferentiated a relation with everybody else, not in opposition, which would be Hegelian, but in a relation, which is the relation of differentiation.
I think this is the perfect place really to sort of, a perfect way to end the whole series, isn't it? Because where we've ended in is openness. We've ended it open, we haven't ended it closed, which is kind of the whole point of it, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
very nicely put.
And good night.
Well, we have 5 minutes to 8 and we have to leave at 8 o'clock, so in a certain way, yes, it is.
Does it still bother you? Do you still feel like you don't know anything? Like you haven't moved
There's
further forward from Socrates?
no, but I've discovered that there is nothing to know.
But no, that's not true. There's everything to know.
5,000 words on that should do the trick.
I want the 3rd season to be commissioned.
No better funding is.
It seems like the scope, let's face it.
And not a
like it's,
cliffhanger.
seems like it's got legs.
There must be a difference between being open-minded and empty-minded, isn't there?
Well, I had a lot of fun. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. Johnny usually ends saying it has been a pleasure and an honor. And it was a pleasure and it was also very fun. And I think Dane can share the same thing.
Yeah, I may realise it was in about a month. I'm sure it
After
probably
the
is.
22nd of April.
You'll be back next year. You'll be sitting in next.
I probably will. Yeah, I probably will. Yeah.
Torture yourself again.
If you have any questions regarding the essay or whatever, just email me. I don't know if Johnny will do one wrap-up seminar after Easter or something. Or we'll see you somewhere.
She's back until May.
Yeah, but after Easter is almost May, isn't it? 22nd.
Well,
Okay.
We could petition. It seems to be all the rage.
You might stay away.
These days, if you want something, you just make a petition and just shout at people.
Yeah, but you don't get it, do you?
Seems to work.